Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama. You probably know some interesting tidbits on each of these former presidents. Maybe you learned about them in history class, or watched a documentary, or read a book that covered some of these men's achievements and failures. But what about lesser-known presidents like Warren G. Harding or Calvin Coolidge? While they may not be as prominent in the history highlights of today, they still had a big impact on American policy and society.
When I began to do a little bit more research on Warren G. Harding, he had many similarities with the last president I covered, namely Donald Trump. Warren G. Harding was the first president to campaign on the slogan, more than a notion, on the slogan of America First. Warren G. Harding inherited a difficult economy, and he really revived the economy through tax cuts, similar to what Donald Trump did 100 years later. Both presidents had a focus on immigration and reducing immigration from outside the United States. So the two presidents had a lot of similarities.
That's Ronald Gruner, the author of We the Presidents: How American Presidents Shaped the Last Century. Gruner's new book is a comprehensive look at each of the presidents between 1921 and 2021. The collection starts with the 29th President of the United States, Warren G. Harding. He was in office between 1921 and 1923, dying halfway into his presidency from a heart attack. Gruner says that Harding is often ranked by historians as one of the worst presidents, but he argues that Harding's reputation is, in fact, misunderstood. He was a key influence in crafting modern immigration and economic policy.
He also was the grandfather of supply-side economics, an economic philosophy that's propagated over the last 100 years, and that was really revived and popularized by Ronald Reagan during the Reagan economic revolution. He did that through his cabinet secretary, Andrew Mellon, who developed the notion that reducing taxes often can increase tax revenues because if people are overtaxed, they avoid tending to pay. Andrew Mellon called that scientific taxation. Today we call it supply-side economics. Another thing that Harding did was he brought in Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover is painted with a rather negative brush because of his presidency during the Depression, but during the 20s, he was considered the best Commerce Secretary the nation had ever had and pioneered many, many things to encourage business.
And Harding wasn't just focused on commerce. During the early 20th century, he was a strong voice in the fight for equality and civil rights across the U.S., including the deeply divided South.
He was the first sitting president to go to the Deep South, Birmingham, Alabama specifically, with a strong message of racial equality, simply saying, we cannot truly be America in a democracy if we don't respect all races and genders and religions as equal. And he took that message to the Deep South, to a very divided crowd, segregated by whites and blacks. I think there were close to tens of thousands of people there. And it was a brave thing to do at the time.
But despite Harding's accomplishments, a couple of large scandals ultimately overshadowed his presidency. Gruner says this is why many historians today paint Harding in a negative light.
After he died, news or information about scandals and fraud in his administration came out, namely the Teapot Dome scandal, in which his Interior Secretary took bribes to give contracts to oil companies. And 5 years after he died, a book was written by the mother of his daughter, writing about the fact that his daughter was conceived when he was a senator, which, of course, painted a negative aspect to his reputation many years after he died, which stayed with him for many years.
Harding is not the only president who suffered from this. In fact, many presidents dealt with scandals that affected how their time in office was viewed. Richard Nixon, for instance, made incredible progress on environmental policy during his years in office, but rarely is he remembered for this work.
The environment was filthy in the 50s and 60s. The air was filthy. You had acid rain decomposing buildings and statues. People were dying, occasionally in the hundreds, when you had a low depression over a city. The rivers were filthy. Cuyahoga caught fire a number of times in Pittsburgh or in Pennsylvania. So he put in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. He instituted OSHA because people were dying at a higher rate in industry than they were in Vietnam in the 1960s. Also, automobile safety. And Richard Nixon did all that. To his credit, it's not recognized now. He was so active in putting in regulations for the environment. The economist Milt Friedman, who was a kind of a free market economist, called Nixon the most socialist president of the 20th century, which to him was a denigration, but actually showed how active Nixon was promoting the environment.
Today, many Americans hear Nixon and automatically connect him with the Watergate scandal. This is also true with the Monica Lewinsky affair that fed into the impeachment of Bill Clinton. It will forever be a stain on his presidency. These scandals rocked the nation and led to lasting criticism for these heads of state. Another source of criticism is making decisions that will impact the nation for years or decades to come. Each of the 46 presidents have made hard choices that not everyone agrees with.
Harry Truman, for example, basically made a lot of hard decisions that made him the most unpopular president leaving the presidency of any time. Yet over the years, he's come to be respected for the difficult decisions that he actually made. So courage is very important. The other thing I personally give a great deal of credit to is character. I mean, people sometimes say, well, I don't like so-and-so, or I don't care for the individual, but I like his policies. Well, I tend to disagree with it. I really think the first thing we as Americans should look for is character, because that ultimately comes out and affects how decisions are made down the road. So character is something we don't see in our presidents, but I think is very, very important.
But sometimes character is difficult to distinguish and separate from the public persona of a politician. Gruner highlights one president that had good character and leadership abilities, but was not as outwardly vocal about his contributions as others in the role.
Many people during Eisenhower's presidency thought he was a kind of a kindly grandfather type who enjoyed playing golf and wasn't really a hands-on presidency. But 20 years after he died, his personal papers came out, and historians saw that he was very, very much active in the decisions being made during his whole 8 years. Even when he was in the hospital with a heart attack, he was giving direction, typically written direction. And his presidency now is called the hidden presidency because he really hid his contributions and let his cabinet and other members of the government take credit for what was accomplished. And that's another example of character being very important.
Qualities like character, leadership, and resilience are just some of the traits that factor into a politician becoming the commander-in-chief. Another part is the strategy behind each presidential campaign. Gruner says that there are many similarities in campaigns across the decades. Take slogans, for instance.
The greatest similarity over the last 100 years goes back to our friend Warren G. Harding. He had two campaign slogans, was America First and a return to normality is the phrase he used, a return to normality. In the early 1920s, the United States was recovering from World War I, the Spanish flu of 1918, and progressive politics very aggressively pursued for 20 years, starting with Teddy Roosevelt. So that was his focus. In 1980, Ronald Reagan campaigned on Let's Make America Great Again, which is essentially the same idea as America First and a return to normality. Reagan was looking back at an earlier time to return America to, just as Harding was. And then, of course, we all know Donald Trump ran on America First and Make America Great, which was just an adoption of Reagan's campaign phrase of Let's Make America Great Again. He just dropped the let's.
In addition to slogans, another similarity is the strategy behind which issues to focus on during presidential campaigns.
Every president has taken advantage of the weaknesses and the problems in the prior presidency he is running against. Nixon did that very effectively when he basically campaigned on law and order, something we hear today after the race riots and the riots against the Vietnam War in the mid to late 1960s. And to some extent, that divided the nation as we see today. And the thing that's changing so rapidly today is that much of that campaigning is so divisive, it's dividing the country into two parts, blue and red.
Over the last 20 to 30 years, Gruner says that this partisan division during campaigning has only further separated Americans based on beliefs. Political campaigning will always be a constant, but this division between Americans has larger implications for democracy and unity. Americans should come together around an elected president that's empowered to serve all. Looking ahead, who knows how campaigns and the presidency will look 100 years from now? Only time will tell. To find out more about the history of U.S. presidents and our guest, Ronald Gruner, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also find his book, We the Presidents, online or request copies to be stocked at your local bookstore. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
What's really cool about Amy Borman is you may not know her name, but you know who she coached, Simone Biles.
Examining the legacies of the coaches who crafted the best athletes in the world. Then,
as a female, she's not afraid to be who she is. She recognizes that she's equal to everyone else. She's not waiting around for someone else to solve the problem. She's out there ahead of it.
The modern appeal of fictional characters like Hermione Granger. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.